Okay, welcome everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the afternoon session of the fourth Digital Transformation in Government Conference. My name is Robert Wiseman from the University of Ottawa as the chair of the conference. At this session, we are very fortunate to have with us Hani Eskandar and Vikesh Majuri, both from the International Telecommunications Union, which is part of the United Nations. And they are working on the GovStack initiative. We had Yolanda's presentation this morning, which gave the broad outlines. We'll be going into more detail with respect to how architecture can facilitate the government transformation endeavors that countries are undergoing. Okay, Hani is the head of the Digital Services Division in the International Telecommunications Union. And Vikesh is a GovStack digital government specialist, and they will both be able to answer questions as well with respect to the building blocks. I know there were some more detailed questions this morning, and these two gentlemen will be able to answer them for you. So without further ado, over to you, Hani, and we look forward to your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Robert. And thank you also for your kind invitation to us to make this presentation. And good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, as Robert mentioned, Yolanda gave in the morning a presentation about GovStack. I would like maybe in the next 30 minutes or so to really try to deep dive a little bit more into the concept of digital transformation and how it links with the concept of GovStack. GovStack, as probably you saw, it's really about adopting architectural approaches to enable government to accelerate their, development of digital government services and in the acceleration of the digital government transformation. So in this presentation, I'll try to explain and share with you how we at the GovStack are making the link between architecture represented in the GovStack and the digital government transformation, and how we see this perhaps as a way to democratize the adoption of architectural approaches and architectural practices. Of course, as you know, the concepts of architecture, enterprise architecture are very old, and there is a very solid foundation. The concept, however, of digital government transformation is relatively new. This concept has been emerging from maybe a few years back, and I think it's very important that there is a clear linkages between why and how architecture is relevant for digital government transformation, and really use the language that anyone can understand in terms of why do we need to adopt architecture or some architecture approach in the digital government transformation. So perhaps I would like maybe to share some perspective first about this concept of government digital transformation. As it's a relatively new term, it's definitely building on previous concepts, like the use of technology for development and ICT for development. But I think the emphasis here more is about the impact. It's moving beyond simply digitizing or digitalizing services with an aspiration to move beyond simple digitization to have a more impact on the institution, or how the institutions or the government operates, and more importantly, to transform citizen perspective. So while there is no maybe one definition where everybody agrees about, but if you look at how governments are defining digital transformation and how they are publishing in their kind of digital transformation strategies or blueprints, there is always kind of two perspectives that are presented in those types of digital government strategies and policies, etc., is really try to explain, define the digital transformation from a citizen perspective, is basically try to explain how citizens' life will and how the citizen experience in dealing with the government will be transformed, and how this could have potential impact on the types of services, how citizens will be have better access to services where they have entitlements, where this can be reflected also into their well-being, how we improve, inclusivity and equity, and how we can really make sure that the citizens are having, much easier and pleasant and smooth type of experience in dealing with the governments. But also there is always the second part of it, is how also government itself is transforming itself, and how the government operations are changing. One good example I felt is how Australia has been able to describe digital transformation in using very concrete use cases, is basically how to describe a narrative where in a concrete cases where the citizen life would be different, the government employee experience also will be different, and also the business experiences will be different. So I think one of the most critical or one of the most impactful is really try to explain it from those types of perspectives. I think, however, there is another narrative that is behind the scene, and here I'm talking about experience when dealing with governments. There is the published, the official version of digital transformation, but also there is some sort, in some cases, an implicit or a kind of back the scene perspective that it's extremely important to understand, really to try to understand how the government is perceiving their own digital transformation. That's why I think beyond what is published in the official documents and the official narratives, there is always what you can sense from the discussion about why a government would put a lot of emphasis on digital transformation. And there are different types of perspectives that should be considered. One of them, which is very, very important, is the political perspective. We have seen for some, campaigns, election campaigns, digitization become high in the agenda. So I think there are now a perception about politicians that talking and pushing the digitization and the government transformation agenda is a very important political perspective and political impact. And it's always very important to take this into consideration in order to really understand the dynamics of why government is investing in digital and who is in power, and what is the direction of the digital transformation, and what also are the timelines that we are talking about. And this is probably a little bit different version and narrative from what you can see in the official narrative. There is another maybe perspective that is also sometimes is also linked to the the political perspective, which I'm calling it the control perspective. I think you can read between the lines why there is so much interest in digitizing government, in moving towards the digitization, beyond, of course, all the obvious reasons of improving government services, etc. There are an important agenda, which is how governments improve its control on different things. And this could be seen on a positive and slightly also risky perspective, because from one side, yes, improving improving transparency, improve accountability, preventing fraud and fighting corruption, etc., etc. Those are very important indeed control perspective that are very legitimate, and I think there is a very good reason why you would do that. But also in some cases there are the other side of the story, that this might be taken too much, that it might have impact on how the citizens are also enjoying their own privacy, and there are some risks of traceability. There are some risks of, maybe not really respecting the privacy of citizens, etc. So I think really understanding the real motivation and the direction in which government is pushing digital transformation, both in the official and less official narrative, is extremely important to be able to locate and to be able to position the architecture in the right way. Because at the end of the day, at least for the sake of this particular presentation, what we are trying to do is to explain why architecture is relevant in the discussion that we are having for digital transformation. I would like to use this sort of high-level definition that we have published in one of the papers that we published recently, maybe a year or two ago, about the relevancy of architecture in digital transformation. It's really about changing how the government can, and how government services are planned, designed, deployed in a way that become personalized, paperless, cashless, presence less, frictionless, etc. And really looking at the citizen perspective issue, but from a holistic 360 degrees view of their needs. So really try to consider the citizen with a suite of services and an overall journey that the citizens needs to, that digitization and digital transformation need to impact the citizen, not on a very narrow scope, the type of service, but to enable different citizen journeys in an integrated and transformational manner, and really try to take this experience from an end to end. And that's one of the arguments and one of the foundation for explaining why it is so important to adopt the architectural approach. So that's some kind of background just to give the context of how we see governments understanding the digital transformation and gives the rationale why they are investing in digital transformation, which timelines and which objectives and targets they are really seeking, because this gives us a lot of insights about how and what is the real case for architecture for digital government transformation. So I think one of the key architectural impact is really it's an enabler for trust, interoperability, and cost efficiency. And I think the link between architecture and digital governance transformation is not yet very clear and obvious in many government officials' mind. And I think this is something that we need to demystify. This is something that we need to explain in simple terms to make it almost a no-brainer, which is not the case. I think architecture is probably seen as a very technical something. It's a lot of buzzwords that they don't understand. And maybe it's an ad hoc thing that you do it or you don't do it, it's fine. And here I'm not necessarily thinking about a full-fledged enterprise architecture, but the adoption of simple and core foundational principles and concepts of architecture in terms of enabling trust, enabling interoperability, enabling reuse, rationalized investments, etc. I think the link between the two is not yet very clear. And the way we are trying to explain this to governments in trying to explain why investing in GovStack, why investing in building your technology stack that is composed of reusable building blocks that are interoperable, etc., is so critical. Government are not necessarily very interested in the technical side of the story. They are interested more what's in it for them from an impact point of view, from what they can announce to the world about their achievements, about their political impact, and what does it mean in real life. the way to explain that if you are really wanting to provide to citizens what you can call transformational services, you really need to consider services where the citizens doesn't need to go to all those types of government services, that the citizens doesn't need to spend hours and hours in queues. They don't need to go from one department to the other, handling documents with them. And really, they need to, have like one sort of a simple way to get access to services. And this is not really possible until you enable the trust and interoperability. You enable the way that you can exchange data in a trusted manner, according to some sort of data sharing policies and data sharing, agreements, that the information flows smoothly. And really, this is how you can do it also in a way that is efficient by really embedding reusability. So the way that you explain why adopting something like the GovStack, which is essentially an architecture approach, is a true enabler of a new generation of government services that are not yet there, and where the citizens are really expecting to see this. The other way that we need to explain that architecture is also enabling sustainable development goals, and probably, as you know, sustainable development goals are the 17th development goals that the UN has come, and many governments are adopting this. It's a very good driver for what you can call your outcomes architecture. If you nail down your outcome architecture and map it to the SDG goals and really explain that at the foundation, the SDG goals are development goals, and the way they are presented always in a circular manner. Why? I think, and this is my own personal assessment, is that all the goals, the development goals, are interlinked. If you take a human being, they have needs in terms of education, health, maybe protection, gender equity. Everything is interlinked, and you cannot really dissociate user experience and citizen experience. And if you would like to approach a citizen with the right level of government services, you need to make sure that all those services are interlinked, and that you can, being able to share your health records with insurance, and you can really have when you are creating educational programs, you can understand your different types of income levels, and so everything is linked. And unless you have this, you cannot really reach the SDGs in the way they are intended to be. Another way of looking at how we position the architecture in the discussion about digital transformation is really one way of looking at government is that all the government services are really based and rooted in legislation. If there is no legislation, there is no most of the service wouldn't exist unless legislations exist. So the service is one way of implementing legislations and enforcing those types of legislation and regulations. Then the way we digitize government services is a very good way to help government enforce their implementation of legislations, but also help the governments to reform those types of legislations. If we are going to wait until legislations will be reformed to improve government services, that will take a lot of time. Actually, the approach of saying how those legislations and services could be implemented in the digital era, and how you can redesign those types of legislation so that you can provide government services that are really truly help governments to enforce and implement those legislation in a cost-efficient manner with transparency, etc. So it's another good argument to say that digitization are critical for you to reform your governments, And if you are really wanting to help digital to reform your governments, you really need to have services that are trusted and interoperable and deployable in cost efficiency. And that's why you need to adopt such approaches, architectural approaches. So what I'm trying to say here is that you really need to create narratives that puts the architecture into a very non-technical language, into current challenges and current discussions that are happening within the government, and really try to focus on the impact or on the enabling capability of architecture, and maybe even without needless to say, even the word architecture, but we understand that those are the enablers for having such, and if you don't adopt this, it would be very difficult to reach, those types of improvements and reforms and transformation at the right level that you can reach. It's also a way to rethink and really retransform governance and institutional models in the government. And this is so critical also because I think governments are now really trying to look on how you improve governance, how you improve accountability, how you improve, improve the institutional capacity, and really how governments are equipped with tools and services that are really empowering them and improving, the way they are governing. And always thinking that the government is structured in a way that is very siloed by nature. And we understand from reality that it's extremely difficult to break out those silos. I think the most possible way to break those silos is really through using digital, because digital indeed can be with if you enable interoperability and trust, you can move beyond those types of boundaries of governments and really move into the whole of government. So the digital is an enabler for moving toward the whole of government. Without it, it would be extremely difficult to, adopt the whole of government approach. And as we all know, whole of government approach is a strategy and a policy objectives that many countries are trying to reach. So positioning and nailing down the discussion around digital transformation under those terms is extremely helpful to be able to explain why do you need architecture. From what we have seen in governments, there are different drivers actually. And I'll tell you maybe some short stories about how we have seen government adoption in countries. In many cases, governments do some work on architecture at different levels, with different depth. But this is left to the technical guys. This is left not being really adopted at the higher level. Because again, there is no full understanding or clarity about why this is strategic and why this is important and what is the impact, etc. Until there is a use case that will drive the adoption of architecture. And particularly if this use case is really supported by a political commitment. Just to give an example, and maybe if I have time, I can go a little bit in details in that later on, is a case of a country who wanted to enable e-voting. And because they didn't have a full-fledged ID, a digital identity database that covers the whole population, they wanted to use different types of identifications, like, for example, driving license and other sort of identifications that the citizens are using, and really try to move ahead into a federated type of digital identity where you can identify yourself under a generic trust and interoperability framework, so that you can being able to vote with being identified by any of those things. So that's a very high political commitment and important political agenda. It is in essence a problem or a use case that requires adopting some architectural principles, and immediately this brings architecture on top of this. So this is one way we saw the difference on how now it is the first secretary who is discussing architecture and not the, the couple of technical guys who are trying to push, to get the attention of senior officials. Now, because it is driven by a very clear use case that is politically important, now architecture becomes an issue and becomes an important thing. Another case in a completely different country where they have started to build their digital services and have they digitized 100, 120 service, but then comes the president who say, I would like to digitize all my countries in a year, which is probably not very realistic, but a scaling up imperative where you really need to scale up quickly, you figure it out quickly, unless you have an architecture in mind, unless you have an architecture that you are following, it will be extremely difficult to scale within the time frame without creating a mess and also without having huge budgets, etc. So that's another push for governments to really look at architecture in a more closer manner and really think and look at what is this building block approach, what is this GovStack is doing and why it is important and how can we adopt it, because we have this scaling up imperative where we need to digitize another 300 service, and honestly, we don't know how to do it within existing time frame and within existing budget. Other countries who are probably more advanced, like Australia, for example, and others, are really looking at how to rationalize and increase the investments in digital, where they have put, obligations that no investment would be done unless you have a kind of an architecture review, that no investments in buying new products unless those are completely, they don't exist in the governments. There is no opportunity for reuse. Nothing is developed from scratch, and even if you would like to develop from scratch, you need to develop your system, but in a way that could be reused for other government departments. So really trying to push and impose architectural principles and approaches to ensure investment rationalization. Some other categories of countries, they understand that this is a best practice, and I can mention countries in Africa. There are very good champion countries in Africa who are trying to really adopt best practices. The challenge I'm seeing with those types of countries that they know it's important, they know it's good, but they didn't have previous experience in implementing it. So they might run the risk of doing too much and overdoing it, and maybe struggling in implementing it. So there is also these types of challenge that it's not only important that you understand why it is important, but you need to have a strong experience in adopting those types of approaches, because there are a lot of experiences that you need to have in-house to be able to drive the right architecture, but also to make it adopted at the different governments, departments, and really steering the investments. What I saw, ironically, that the citizen discussion and citizen-centric got a little bit lost in the way government are driving the investments and driving the use of architecture, though citizen centricity needs to be at the heart of the discussions. But in many, many cases, it got a little bit sided, and it becomes a good motto or a good model to talk about, but not really in practice. So in line with, or in parallel with the high discussions on digital government transformation, there is a new trend that is coming very strongly now in the development discussions that could be a very good anchor to introduce architecture into government transformation, which is the concept of DPI, digital public infrastructure. This concept actually, it's a completely new term, nothing really new about it, but the term is new. Digital public infrastructure, I think it's coined maybe 3-4 years only back, but now it's becoming the #2 topic discussions after digital transformation or in the same discussion with digital transformation. It's basically to say, if you want to build your future, particularly in government services, you need to have a service infrastructure or a digital infrastructure that can help you enable the scaling up and really provides you with the layers and foundation to enable trust and interoperability. When we talk about DPI, we usually means shared services and interoperability framework for particularly digital identity, payment, trusted exchange, consent and registries, how you manage registries and how you maintain the interoperability among all those components. But some people would like to see it even goes for a little bit more types of shared services. Regardless of the scope of it, it's a very important concept and trend that really can help to push the use or the importance of using enterprise architecture in the context of governments, because it allows affordability and scalability. It democratizes digitization, because now the government departments, they don't need to build those types of foundational services, and they don't need to worry about all the underlying systems and services that they need to build their services on top of them. It becomes much more easier to develop services in a trusted and interoperable manner without having to worry much about those, back-end systems. And really, it's also about saying, if you own your DPI, if you own and make it interoperable and make it plug and play, that you can plug and play products if they are interoperable, then you are avoiding vendor lock-in. This is a very important, because if you are setting your infrastructure, it's critical where the whole economy will depend on, and you don't want this to be in the hand of one or two companies. You would like to make sure that it's really built on sound architectural approaches that really allows you for, this sort of interoperable and plug and play type of approach. Another thing that is really interesting is that if you manage to code, between quotes, all your principles of digital, how you protect privacy, how you ensure government transparency, how you ensure accountability, responsible data use, interoperability, inclusiveness, etc. If you try to build those building blocks that are really complying with those types of concepts and those types of principles that really protect the citizen from increased control or increased or abuse or whatever, then you are making sure that the services will be built on a layer that ensures minimum transparency and minimum accountability and minimum respect of the privacy. So that's why now a lot of donors and development partners, development banks are really looking at investing in building those types of digital public infrastructure. So to some sort of summarize the landscape of the discussions that are really prevailing in the development and within the UN and within other development partners, really is a topic of digital government transformation. It's at the heart of it. Digital public infrastructure is being seen as a key investment that needs to be done to power governments with the right sort of infrastructure that really can help them in building and deploying digital government services that will move towards real transformation. The way now everybody is preaching how you build up your digital public infrastructure is using interoperable components, very much similar to what India did and Estonia and so many other countries, is basically using this kind of reusable building blocks, payments, ID, consent, registry, registration. To build them, you can potentially use open source or what people now call digital public goods. So some of the building blocks could be implemented using digital public goods. However, and this is the most important things, that those components needs to be able to plug together in a way that they can build a whole or an integrated stack or what you can call a digital platform for governments, or a digital public infrastructure that works as a whole and not as siloed blocks, because you can adopt building blocks that are not interoperable. So the whole thing so now the investments are geared towards building up this infrastructure. So obviously, if you are not really using the architectural approaches, it will be extremely impossible. So what I'm seeing now, there is a more and more stronger case to build up infrastructure based on architecture, where more and more governments and development partners are able to invest in. Now, let me maybe close with this very, very important point that I would like to highlight in my presentation: where to start. This is number 2 questions after they understand why GovStack, why architecture is important, how it relates to digital transformation, DPI, etc. Now the question comes, where to start? And there are probably different ways. I can explain 2 different extremes. One is a pure top-down, what you say, I need to have a full picture first. I basically start at the end, kind of. I need to have a full picture, how this whole thing will fit together. I need to have a full-fledged architecture in place before I even invest in anything. And there is a completely different approach, which is say, no, I need to develop a quick win. I need to do something quickly. I need to use what I have now. So it seems that those are 2 approaches that are contradictory, or they don't work together. I mean, whether you have too much planning, and this is sometimes a perception of using enterprise architecture, you are doing too much planning, versus no planning, which sometimes people call it agile, which is not correct. And even too much planning is not correct as an enterprise architecture. But this is this perception that people think agile is no planning and too much planning for enterprise. I think what we are talking about is something in the middle, probably, which is good enough or fit for purpose planning. And that's why we in GovStack, we are trying to adopt both approaches. We are trying to say, yes, you need to have a proper overarching planning for your overall enterprise, but also you need to match that with a concrete use case. Start with a real problem. Start with a small set of a larger service. Establish your first building blocks, 1 or 2, and then expand. But when you build up those types of platforms, you build them because they are needed to solve a concrete problem, as opposed because it's good to have them, or theoretically speaking, is good to have them. And this is what we have seen in countries who have gone through an intensive enterprise architecture approach. And when they started to implement, they felt that there is huge upfront costs that they are not capable of investing in because it costs too much. So that's what I meant by not having the experience in implementing full-fledged architecture. You need to really start with a concrete use case, do the right architecture within this use case, that you are solving a real problem for a real user, and then take it up from there. And this is partially what we are doing. I'll maybe skip quickly about, I wanted to share an example of a country where I mentioned that it was, the driver was really to a very clear use case about e-voting, enabling e-voting. And it was important to have a federated ID. A federated ID is an architectural problem that needs to have some architecture in place, needs to have interoperability, etc. And this could be the real introduction to a longer journey or a longer roadmap for introducing architecture. And because of this use case, the architecture, as I mentioned, jumped from being an ad hoc thing in the hand of technical guys, where now it becomes a senior official type of interest that they would like and understand why it is important to adopt it. So in the GovStack, we, as I mentioned, we try to balance between those 2 approaches, where you need to embed architecture in policies, in your government strategy, whole of government EA, etc., but also try to have those types of use cases where you focus on resolving a particular problem using service design and designing the architecture, prototyping, and really piloting, and really use this as a way to kick off and drive your digital transformation journey. I'll stop here. I hope that was clear. And moving back to Robert, if you have specific questions, I didn't follow the chat, unfortunately, but very glad to take any question, if any.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bob Wiseman, there are not many not many questions. I really thank you. That was an excellent presentation. And I think you're really emphasizing the need to demystify architecture. Architecture is just basically a structured analysis of how you want to do your digital transformation journey. Okay, it's nothing more, nothing that. It includes technology, but it's much more. Talks about user journeys and the like. And I think the point is well raised. The one question I have for you is there any intellectual property issue? Are they all Creative Commons 4 where people can use it?
Yes, actually, everything that we produce is on GitHub. So it's under an open source license. I think it's Apache 2. All the specification, basically what we try to do is really try to take those building blocks that are core and try to unpack them to try to come up with minimum common functionalities and interoperability APIs, open APIs for each of the building blocks, and everything is on GitHub. And you can just, if you Google GovStack Gitbook, there are two main resources available, and maybe Vikash, you can paste the link for the Gitbook for the specification. And also we have developed a country implementation playbook, which is basically a step-by-step. It's very much based on this approach that I described, but it goes in much more details on how we move step-by-step by countries, with countries to embed and adopt those types of practices in a kind of a step-and-step and kind of use case type of approach.
Okay, great. Just a quick one, the enterprise architecture, the Archimate profile, is that fairly available?
No, sorry, can you maybe explain, did we use
Evidently,
Archimate?
you said there's an enterprise architecture Archimate profile, which is a standard architecture modeling language.
Yes.
Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with that, but we didn't necessarily use it in our specification.
Okay.
Because I mean, the specification was also laid in a way that it's also easy to kind of absorb and understand. So we didn't necessarily use Archimate in the specification. Yes.
Fully understand. Yeah, Archimate is an open group, our open group standard for architecture modeling, but it's sometimes like I said, presentation is a bit of an issue with that, but it is very effective. The next one is, can you give an example of how the Sustainable Development Goals were used to take an integrated approach?
Very good question. Actually, let me think of a good example, which is real. See, for example, in India, where they have really invested in social security.
Yep.
And by social security, they wanted to manage social protection programs, and particularly government subsidies and cash transfer programs to citizens. And as you can imagine, with the size of India, there is a lot of opportunities for fraud and corruption and ghosts records and huge type of leakages. This is obviously a very important SDG, because this type of social protection touches different aspects of life. Health, you can run a voucher program for health, for example. You can run another program for education. You can run another program for pension, etc. So the fact that all those types of requirements are needed it really pushed the government to look at how you can have an integrated approach to serve all the social protection services under a kind of a common platform and a common DPI. And that's why they had to build their DPI based on three things: the ID, that you need to prove your identity through authentication, biometric authentication. They have invested in building a payment sort of platform they call the UPI, Unified Payment Interface, where you can pay anyone on any type of modality, whether banked or unbanked. You can pay for mobile wallets, for example. And then the last one is about data exchange, how you can manage sharing your documents and share the data and have what they call account aggregators. So the fact that you have this sort of different needs that are across different sectors, but all serve different SDGs, but they needed to be integrated because at the end of the day, we are serving the same citizen. And that was a very good drive for, for establishing these types of public infrastructure, digital public infrastructure, to really manage, all those types of different SDGs within the same investment.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for a great presentation. By the way, you might want to just simply copy and paste the links that Vikash Majuri put into the chat with respect to all the resources that GovStack has. They're quite extensive.
Yeah.
So, Hani and Vikash, thank you ever so much for taking the time to present to us. It was greatly appreciated. And anyways, hopefully we'll be seeing each other in the open group, but hopefully, like I said, we can basically touch base and maybe provide some resources from participants in this particular session who might want to contribute to the overall contribution to creation of building blocks and the like. So without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you.
To all attendees right now, we have various presentations coming up. We have Alec Blair from the Alberta Health Systems in stream 1, and we've got Dr. Stéphane Gagnon, who's going to be talking about Business and Technology Management Program. He's from the University of Quebec en Outaouais. So without further ado, thank you very much, and please go to your next link. Thank you. Cheers.